So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming along today. I think that going to go up to enable us to run the session as best that we probably possibly can. And that slide is going to say that unless you're actually speaking or one of the on the panel, it's best that you turn off your camera and microphone until it's time for you to speak. You can use the chat to ask questions. Sometimes the chat doesn't work, in which case just send your questions to events@ersa.org.uk, and that link is in the chat. And then also you can use the raise hand function in the on your panel in order to indicate that you want to ask a question. I know that we have some people here who are looking forward to asking questions and have sent some questions in, so thank you very much for that. I'm going to get a couple of minutes just to allow people to arrive, and I'm just going to start by saying, so I'm just going to encourage everybody who's coming now just to mute themselves and turn off their camera. Just to welcome you to this session on women. And I suppose really what we need to be looking at is there a need to have particular sorts of support to support women? Are women half of the population and therefore we should just be providing a general service, or are there particular needs that we want to look at? And what has COVID meant for that? So a year ago, we might have been looking at things in a very different way, but what has COVID and the Covid recession meant for women's employment and the future of women's employment? How have women and how will employers react to that? And then we want to look at how we as organisations in employability can best support women. So what can we do with the new Restart programme, with any projects that are more local and smaller than that? And also, are there particular things that we need to do for women who want to go into employment? So we have got a real Christmas cracker of a panel here. I am so delighted that have joined us today, and we've got people who are experts in their field. And I had a really interesting question sent in about, you know, what do the people on the panel, what do you know about this program? What do you know about women? So what I'm just going to sort of introduce the panel as a whole to begin with. So we have Mary-Ann Stephenson, who is director of the Women's Budget Group. And after any big economic event, you'll see that they are one of the organisations that are most quoted on looking at the impact on women. We have Rosie, Gloster and Beth Mason, who are from the Institute for Employment Studies, and many of us have been following their work over the last few months, looking at all their work that Tony Wilson does and the whole team there about what's happening to employment. And then we've got Professor Rouse, who is the Professor of Entrepreneurship and head of the Sylvia Pankhurst Centre for Gender Research in Manchester University. So we've got three people who are real experts in this field, but also have hands-on experience. For example, I know Mary-Ann has done a lot of work in Coventry, in local women's projects. I know that Julia is working on projects that really look at how really low-paid women can be involved in setting up as self-employed. And we know that the IES are always looking at how the impact on people who are furthest away from the labour market. So my name's Liz Sewell. I am director of the Belina GRoW programme, and our project is all about supporting women get ready for work. GRoW is about getting ready for work. And we work across London. I'm also on the board of ERSA and chair the ERSA Women's Forum. And we will be starting our main meetings in February, so I'll tell you a bit more about that at the end. So Laura, can I just check with you now that we are ready to go? Is that okay for us to start the session?
Ready to go, yes. Thanks, Liz.
Okay, that's great. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much. And I'm going to begin by asking Marianne to talk about the impact of the COVID recession, where women are now in terms of economic situation, and maybe lessons that we can learn from the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. So my name is Marianne Stephenson. I'm the director of the Women's Budget Group. What we do is we analyse the impact of economic policy on women and men, and we also promote an approach called gender responsive budgeting, which is a way of ensuring that economic policy is properly analysed for its gender impact and that it takes gender into account. And I'm going to focus on three things today. The first one is the sort of background, why we need a gendered approach to the Restart programme, and particularly post-COVID, the impact that COVID has had on women. And then a little bit about, what's happened in the past and what lessons we can learn from that, and then some of the key areas that we need to focus on. So to start off with, why we need a gendered approach? Well, it's not a secret, I think, that COVID has exposed and exacerbated pre-existing inequalities faced by women in the labour market. So we've seen, for example, that women have been more likely to be furloughed. In 75% of constituencies, women are the majority of those furloughed. In fact, the highest proportion of women furloughed is in the Chancellor's constituency. Which is interesting. I'm not quite sure why that is, but we also know that women have been more likely to lose income, although I'm sure we'll hear more from the Institute of Employment Studies about the total job losses between women and men. And we know that women were differently situated in the economy before COVID happened, and that this has had an impact on the way COVID has affected them. So women are overrepresented among key workers. For example, 39% of working mothers are key workers, but also overrepresented among workers in sectors that have been most badly affected, kind of lockdown sectors. So 58% of retail workers are women, and that figure is actually higher in high street retail. You get more men working in warehousing and distribution, which hasn't been so badly hit because of the move to online shopping. Similarly, if you look at hospitality and tourism, women are the majority of workers. And we also know that for mothers in particular, there's been a hit as a result of COVID. So research by Pregnant Then Screwed, which was carried out recently, showed that 46% of mothers who'd been made redundant said that the lack of childcare, closure of childcare, was a factor in their selection of redundancy, and that 72% of mothers have worked fewer hours and had lower earnings because of a lack of childcare. And there are problems going forward, particularly in the childcare sector. We know that a quarter of childcare providers think that it's likely that they will close within the next year, which is going to have a devastating impact not only on the women working in that sector, but also on the parents who rely on them, that's childcare, in order to be able to work. And it is, although we should see childcare as a responsibility for both parents, in actual fact, it's mainly mothers who are affected by those cuts. So none of this is particularly new. Prior to the crisis, women were more likely to be low paid. 69% of low paid workers are women. That's low pay calculated on people earning 60% or less of average earnings. We know about the pay gap. That's often presented as the gap in hourly pay for full-time workers, but a high proportion of women work part-time, and even those working full-time may not work the same hours as men, which has an impact if you're paid on an hourly basis. So as well as the pay gap, we also need to think about the earnings gap, because that's the actual difference in the amount of money women and men take home. And that stands at about 43% at the moment. among working age adults. We also know that women were more likely to be in insecure employment, so that the majority of workers on 0 hours contracts, and they're less likely to have some employment rights. So, for example, women are the majority of those who don't qualify for statutory sick pay. And at the heart of all of this inequality in the labour market is women's unpaid work, the work that women do in the home. We know that prior to COVID, women did about 60% more unpaid work than men. This gap narrowed slightly during the first lockdown as men did more, although women did more as well. But if you look at, for example, the IFS did a study looking at heterosexual couples with children, and they found that the only kind of work and family setup where women didn't do more unpaid work was if the woman was continuing to work outside the home during lockdown and the man had been furloughed. And in those situations, they did roughly the same amount of childcare. So in all other circumstances, women were doing more. Now, there'd been some hope that this slight narrowing of the gap would stick, that it would mark a change in behaviour, that we would see more men doing unpaid work. But new data that came out this week from ONS suggests that the gap is widening again. So the most recent data from ONS, looking at post first lockdown, women were doing 63% more housework than men and 99% more childcare than men. That's a really significant gap. And the reason this is important is because the more time women spend on unpaid work, the less time they have for paid work, which is why women earn less, own less, and are more likely to be poor. So any programme to address the employment crisis caused by COVID has to focus not only on the paid labour market, but also on unpaid work, because it's a significant factor in impacts on women. Lone parents in particular are likely to find it very, very hard to engage with the labour market unless there is support with childcare, because obviously they don't have a partner to share those responsibilities with. The second issue is that women work in different sectors than men. So if you look at the focus from the government so far, it's all been build, 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 and various announcements on investment in physical infrastructure. But we know that women make up only 12% of construction workers. So we need to be thinking about two things there. First of all, developing schemes to provide training and encourage the recruitment of women into non-traditional roles. And I think government's got a key role to play here, because if you are funding infrastructure development, then you can set criteria on which, that have to be met if that funding is forthcoming. But secondly, we need to not just simply focus on those sectors which employ men, but also think about traditionally female sectors. One of the things that I found a bit frustrating in some of these conversations has been a lot of conversation about the need to create skilled jobs, as though some of the jobs that women are doing are not skilled. Our idea of what skilled and unskilled is distorted, largely by pay. So many of the jobs traditionally done by women are low paid, but maybe highly skilled, for example, care work. So thinking about going forward, I thought it was useful to learn some lessons from the past. And the first thing that I looked at was a project that the Women's Budget Group acted as technical advisors on in 2003-04. And this was examining the New Deal for lone parents and also the New Deal for people over 25, as well as schemes to support small business startups among underrepresented groups. And what was interesting about that project was that it had backing from the Treasury at a senior level, ministerial level, and from senior officials. And there was a really strong recognition for the need for gender analysis and a gendered approach. But this enthusiasm wasn't shared among those who were actually implementing the programme. First of all, there was an assumption that gender equality meant treating women and men the same, even if that approach was based on the average needs of men, not the average needs of women. Now, there is a very strong argument that says women are half the population. We don't need special treatment. What we do need is our idea of what is normal to reflect more than just what is normal for men's needs. And we see this all the time in our work at the Women's Budget Group, where researchers will say, oh, you know, we looked at this particular project, we only looked at male employees because women don't have normal working patterns, for example, as though half the, you know, the working patterns of half the population was somehow abnormal. Some officials went a bit further and counted up the number of women and men applying for particular projects and thought that was a gendered approach, but didn't go further. And we see this a lot. It's not an unusual problem. We see it often in equality impact assessments. So, for example, when you look at the equality impact assessments governments have produced on social security changes, what they tend to do is look at the proportion of women claiming social security and then the proportion of women who will be impacted by the changes that they're planning to introduce and say, well, if the proportions are roughly equal, there is no gendered impact. Now, the fact that more women than men are going to lose money isn't considered a gender impact. So we need an analysis that actually understands what we're trying to achieve here, which is programs that work for everybody, for women and for men. And that means, as I said earlier, recognising the significance of unpaid work in barriers facing women. And the New Deal for lone parents, although there were many issues around it, did actually start from the position that lone parents had care responsibilities, and these needed to be taken into account. And that's not just about thinking about things like childcare and flexible work. It's also thinking about things like transport links. You know, the Young Women's Trust did some work a few years ago that found one of the biggest barriers for young mothers in entering the labour market was lack of access to transport, because their transport needs involved taking the kids to childcare and then getting on to work, and many of them didn't have access to cars. And we also need programs that don't simply make allowances for the main carer, but treat all workers as though they might be carers. So one of the problems we've got at the moment with universal credit is within a couple, and one partner can be designated the main carer, and they have some allowances made for their childcare responsibilities and their job seeking requirement, but the other parent has absolutely no allowances made at all. So that reinforces the inequality between women and men, because it's largely women who are designated the main carer, and so they're the ones who have allowances made and can work flexibly, and their male partners can't. And the final thing we need to do is focus on a range of sectors, and here I just wanted to quickly flag up the work that was done for our Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which published in September. We did a report on a care-led recovery, looking at the number of jobs that could be created by investing the same amount of money in the care sector as money invested in construction. And we found investing in care could create 2.7 times as many jobs as investment in construction, more jobs for men and many more jobs for women. So I know I've got a bit over time now, I'm sorry about that, but that's a kind of overview of the approach that I think we need to take. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a fantastic introduction to the state we're in and what we need to do. And I suppose I take away from that issue that women earn less, own less, and are more likely to be poor, and that what we need to have is programs that address that as a normal situation, that it's not a special treatment, that we're looking at it as a normal situation. So if there's anybody that wants to ask a question directly on that, if you put it in the chat or if you put your hand up, I'm just having a quick look backwards and forwards between the two. Does anybody have their hand raised for this? If they do, we can. Really,
You've
got Laura Dewar with her hand up.
Laura Dewar. So can I ask Laura Dewar? Laura.
I need to have money in my account then for PayPal to send it.
Yes, you do. Okay, Laura, can we ask you to ask your question?
Okay. Thanks very much, Marianne. That was really interesting, and thank you for referring to the particular situation with single parents who are obviously at the extreme end of lots of the gender equality issues. And I suppose a lot of a lot of mothers are going to, as you say, have already lost their job and are going to lose their job when the furlough scheme ends. And how do you think that the back to work support can really be kind of focused for these group of parents? Because I worry that there'll just be the normal system of like, look for jobs, you will be sanctioned if you don't look for a job. And that kind of longer term look at someone's circumstances and situation to try and get them the best job that they can. And so that, and also I was interested yesterday that TimeWise talked about they do an annual index of flexible jobs. And although in percentage terms, there are slightly more jobs advertised as flexible, they're not seeing what they thought was going to be quite a revolution in flexible jobs being advertised, despite the fact that, you know, overnight so many people work from home. So I suppose, it's two questions. How are job centres and this new restart programme really going to help mothers to get the best job that they can? And how can the government do more for the job market to make sure that the available jobs, including job creation, isn't just focused on that full-time model?
Thank you. Very clear questions.
Thanks for that, Laura. I think those are really important questions, and I think it's really important that you raised the issue of the sanctions regime and the approach to getting people into work that we've seen over the last few years, which is basically punitive. And it may well be you that said this to me, Laura, actually.
Oh.
You know, treats all job seekers as though they are kind of lazy teenage boys in their 20s that need to be kicked out of bed.
Yes, I think I did say that.
Yes,
Yeah.
Well, exactly. And that's really stuck with me, actually, because it's based on the idea that what you need, you know, it's not that people want to work and that may be facing barriers to get into the labour market. It's actually that they need to be forced into work through a system of sanctions and through a system of having a social security system that is as ungenerous as possible. It kind of reminds me of the kind of Victorian idea of least eligibility, that you have to make provisions so awful that people will choose to do anything else. Otherwise, people will take advantage. And we've seen, you know, even the government itself seems to have recognised the flaws in that by the fact that they increased universal credit at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, that the level of benefits which they had thought was good enough for people who were unemployed prior to the pandemic suddenly isn't good enough for people who everyone can see are unemployed through no fault of their own, as those who were there previously. It was a question of fault. And so I think we need to go back, as you say, to a model that starts with, you know, what are the barriers to people accessing the labour market, a much more individualised and tailored sources of support, where you can actually help people through finding childcare, finding these other things, rather than a process that's about policing and monitoring how many job applications have you done this week, regardless of whether these are jobs that you're suited for or anything else. And also an approach that doesn't, we need to get away from the idea that work first is absolutely always the answer for everybody, because one of the things we know about women workers is you don't just face glass ceilings, you also face sticky floors. So while it is true that for some people, moving out of unemployment into employment is a really important first step, and then people can progress from there, actually a lot of women go into low-paid jobs and that's where they get stuck. Whereas with a bit of training and support, they could find a job that was more suitable, where there was more prospects for progression.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and I hope you'll stay now, and we'll have more questions at the end. So, Julia, you have your hand up. Is there something in particular that you wanted to say on this before we move forward? No, okay. So now I'm going to introduce. We have two speakers from the IES, Rosie Gloster, who's a senior research fellow, and her colleague Beth Mason, and they are going to look at what the situation is now in terms of employment and how we might be able to develop a better restart programme. So let's hand over to you, and I think you've got some slides to show us. Is that right?
That's brilliant. Thank you. Sorry. So my camera back on, get my ducks in a row. Thank you very much, Liz. I'll just try and share the screen now so people can see. Has that come through okay? There we go. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for inviting us to speak, Liz. That's much appreciated. So Beth and I have been trying to draw together a range of the work from IES. We've been quite busy at IES since the pandemic, and so we're trying to draw together some of our recent work for Gingerbread, for the ILO analysis that we've been doing regularly for the Labour Force Survey, and Beth's going to talk particularly about some work we did for the Young Women's Trust as well. So we'll talk a bit about the labour market before COVID and where women were in that, and then look at what aspects of how people think about work have changed since COVID, and then what next, what does that mean for employment support programmes. So thinking about the labour market and women before COVID, I'm sure much of this is familiar to you from previous work, but also as Marianne said, the sorts of jobs that women were working in, so more likely to be health and social work, more likely to be retail, education, etc. And obviously more likely to be working part-time, and a group of women who were economically inactive because they were looking after home or family. So we kind of take a step back. This is drawing on some of our work we've done around careers, how people think about work, what influences whether or not people can work, and how they make decisions about that. So this model kind of in the top left-hand corner is around somebody's beliefs or identities. So what they believe in, whether they see themselves as a worker or a parent, the type of work that they're interested in, and the sort of extent to which they feel like women have a role in the home, doing childcare themselves, or happy to use other sources of formal paid childcare. Thinking also then about the bundle of things that affects whether or not someone can work in terms of their own personal situation and their household situation a bit more widely. So whether they're in a single or coupled household, maybe their health, whether they have health conditions, if they have children, how many children, and also their sort of financial security. So if they have any savings and income as well, those kind of things in that bundle. The bottom left is a bundle of things about someone's skills, qualifications, their work history, the kind of experience that they have at work, and sort of formal qualifications. On the right hand side, at the top, we have the labour market. So the sorts of opportunities and the constraints there. So the availability of jobs, how well paid they are, whether or not there's flexible working, the attitudes of employers, transport links, those kind of things. In the middle, the kind of social networks, so information and support that they might be able to draw on from family, friends, colleagues, employability service providers, etc., etc. And then in the bottom right, childcare availability and affordability. And so we want to just, in the sort of the grand scheme of what affects whether someone can work, draw out how those things change fundamentally with the pandemic. So in terms of thinking about personal things that would have affected families and women in particular, the increased caring responsibilities, not just for children, but also for maybe elderly relatives, neighbours, the sort of sense of community, losing support networks as well, particularly around childcare, maybe grandparents who would have undertaken some childcare informally were shielding or no longer able to help, etc. Work-life balance. So that just, you know, the merging of identities of a parent and a worker forced on people because of the pandemic and the closure of schools and other childcare settings. Also thinking about the financial security of the household, whether people were put on furlough and had a big reduction in their income, whether they lost their job, etc. Just changing the household situation, the finances there quite significantly. And as we all know, COVID has had an effect on people's mental health and as well as physical health because of not being able to have other operations or the kind of access to healthcare that was there before because of the priority of COVID in the NHS. And then lastly, just thinking about the different effects of the virus on people of different ages. It's obviously been more prevalent in certain regions and has affected people from different ethnic backgrounds differently as well. How's COVID affected other labour market things? So we talked about access to childcare, the furlough scheme, thinking about the redundancies and particularly a lack of vacancies that's come through in our labour market analysis, this sort of hiring freeze. There's a lot of slack in the system and people are using the furlough scheme and are not necessarily hiring at the moment. And then in terms of how people are receiving services, so there's a kind of remote service delivery. I think as well it's really highlighted in terms of the digital services, the people's maybe lack of access to IT or digital skills, particularly in some communities, to be able to participate in how services are being delivered at the moment. And then also this change to more remote and flexible working for some types of job roles. So in terms of how women have been specifically affected, this draws on our work from a case study with the Young Women's Trust. I was going to hand over to Beth at this point. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rosie. So as Rosie says, I'm going to talk a bit about how these influences have impacted women in particular. And this is drawing on some work I did earlier this year with Young Women's Trust, which sort of came to a series of blogs that I wrote, which included some case studies of some young women that explored this subject. And so that work really highlighted three main ways that women have been affected, and that's their financial stability, their health, both mental and physical, and their caring responsibilities. So starting off with the financial stability, so we know that the ongoing pandemic and the lockdown has had a disproportionate effect on people in low-paid work. So that's temporary work, part-time work, people on 0 hours contracts, which is a type of work more commonly taken up by women, as well as young people, people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, and people with low qualifications. We also know the lockdown has hit some sectors more than others, so retail, hospitality, leisure, travel and tourism. And again, those are the sectors that are more commonly, women more commonly work in than men, at 36% of young women compared to 25% of young men. And that women are actually twice as likely as men to have lost their job as a result of the pandemic. And so being furloughed and unsure about what the future holds, or out of work, struggling to make sort of your universal credit make ends meet, or competing for the few vacancies that there are alongside everyone else that's also looking for work, has left women in a really financially precarious position. So a survey that Young Women's Trust did actually showed that 84% of young women were concerned about their future finances as a result of the pandemic, and 64% said that they felt they would lose money because of the crisis. And this has, or it will lead to increased use of food banks, increased debt among women. It will affect women's ability to take up training and education, particularly for those with caring responsibilities. And financial instability can impact on people's work performance, and it can also impact on mental health. Move on to the next slide, Rosie. Rosie,
sorry, it crashed. There you go.
Oh.
Sorry.
Take your time. These things happen.
Great, thank you. So thinking about health, so we know that women's mental health was in crisis before the pandemic even began, particularly among young women. In England in 2014, about 1 in 5 women reported concerns with their mental health compared to 1 in 8 men. And recent research this year showed that just by April, so just a month into the lockdown, the population prevalence of clinically significant mental distress had already risen by 8%. And being young, being a woman, and having dependent children had a significant influence on the extent that mental health had deteriorated in that time frame. And this again was supported by findings from the Young Women's Trust survey that showed that 73% of women had experienced an increase in stress and anxiety as a result of COVID. And there was a number of factors that were having an effect on women's health. So there was anxiety about the virus itself and anxiety about the easing of restrictions, particularly as women in employment are twice as likely to be key workers as employed men, which means they were facing significant health risks whilst they're at work. There's the isolation associated with the lockdown and relationship difficulties, increased caring responsibilities, which I'll come on to in a moment, stress and from work, managing the sort of home working pressures and the sort of blurring lines of home and work life and responsibilities, particularly for mothers who are juggling sort of many roles. They're juggling the childcare, being educators, as well as trying to do their own work, and the financial stress, which I've already talked about. I also felt it would go amiss not to mention the rise in domestic violence during the lockdown and the impact that this has on physical and mental health. The charity Refuge reported a 25% increase in calls and online requests since the lockdown began in March, and this could be due to a number of factors such as forced coexistence with an abuser, economic stress, fears about the virus, isolation, and also that having fewer visitors to your household in the lockdown means evidence of abuse could go unnoticed. A survey by Women's Aid showed that 67% of survivors who were currently experiencing abuse said that it got worse as a result of COVID, and 76% said they were having to spend more time with their abuser. And the service providers have also reported that they're finding their capacity to support survivors has been impacted by the lockdown and by COVID, with 84% saying they've had to cancel and reduce their services. So we can move on to the next one, Rosie.
Is that there with caring responsibilities?
Yeah, right. Brilliant. So as we've already heard, women carry out on average 60% more unpaid care work than men. And this includes caring for children and relatives, that we've already talked about, sort of pandemic, that includes sort of caring for vulnerable others, people who might be shielding, caring for your neighbours. Obviously also includes your regular household chores and cooking, and also sort of the mental and emotional labour of managing, planning and organising a household, which typically falls on the woman. The lockdown seriously impacted access to childcare with school and nursery closures, and during lockdown women continued to spend more time on childcare than men, on average 2 hours more each day, not to mention single parents, which have already been discussed, of whom approximately 86% are women. And the issues with childcare were worsened when the job retention scheme wound down before schools and childminders were fully operational, and family support that many parents rely on was still restricted. And even now, sort of available childcare options, your informal and formal, are limited, with sort of nurseries having social distancing requirements, which reduces capacity, health concerns of relatives who may have helped in other circumstances, limitations on household mixing and support bubbles. And so there's a massive need for employers to be flexible in easing difficulties faced by parents, particularly single parents, to meet the sort of trade-offs between working and caring. And many parents reported that furlough was a mixed blessing, because while it facilitated them in their sort of caring responsibilities, sort of homeschooling, it was also perceived as having negative impacts on their finances and their future career development. And so women have had to adapt to sort of merging identities throughout this pandemic, of being a woman, being a mother, a worker, an educator, and the impact that can have on engagement and satisfaction at work. It can mean that they're less able to perform and contribute to their best of their ability, impacting on development and progression, as well as sort of engagement and satisfaction having an impact on their mental health. And I think it's worth saying that sort of typically a monetary value isn't awarded to unpaid care work, and that can lead to underinvestment in policies and services that could address the issue and the associated social and economic losses. And as well as the financial aspects of it, unpaid work means that women lose out on opportunities for job search, for taking up training and education. And going forward, in some households, there may have to be a trade-off between which person in a household might remain in work or return to work, and that negotiation is typically decided based on who's the higher earner. And with the gender pay gap at 16%, that's most likely going to lead to women remaining at home. So I'll hand back over to Rosie now, who's going to talk a bit about the implications this has for employability programmes.
Thank you, Beth. So before I do that, just a few slides of our recent data analysis. So I wanted to highlight just the fall in the number of women working part-time. That's the big yellow blob on the far right-hand side. And we think there could be a couple of reasons underlying that, just a change in kind of household behaviour and in terms of people being on furlough, maybe a quirk of the furlough scheme, because for a period you had to be working, you couldn't be part-time furloughed. And also just there, the big blue block in terms of the number of increased full-time work amongst women as well. So this kind of opposing ends of the spectrum, and potentially increase in full-time work amongst women in the health sector required to deal with the pandemic. This was from our published last week from our report for the ILO. So in terms of analysis on wages, the fall has been particularly great in the UK. We're towards the top end there of other European countries that were in the study, a fall of 9.2% in wages. But obviously there's a split by gender, which is where we're coming from. So 12.9% amongst women and just 5.5% amongst men. So that's explained by loss of work as well as a loss of hours. But in the UK, it was particularly large fall for women compared to men in terms of other countries. And then just as a sort of a more optimistic slide at the end, I think we wanted to share that although the yellow sectors show where there are job losses, there are also sectors that are hiring at the moment. So these included sort of financial services and public administration services. So I guess that leads us on to sort of predictions of what next for employment. We've noticed that there are limited vacancies, that there's lots of competition for jobs. We feel like there's underemployment, and at the moment the sort of plan for jobs, the focus, as we've said, is on construction, manufacturing, where women are typically underrepresented. Perhaps flexible working will become more normalised, but there are obviously lots of limitations on the types of jobs that can be done flexibly and where they can be done and the times that people can work. And then thinking about all of these things and around what might be needed in terms of employment support. So I think we've tried to highlight the need for a person-centred approach. So everyone, regardless of gender, will have specific individual needs. We'll probably need a programme of holistic support, and COVID's really shone the light on the requirement for mental health, support with care and childcare, debt, and also digital skills. And I think there'll be a legacy of those support needs that follow through into the Restart programme or whatever else follows that. A need for information, advice and guidance and retraining. So there's going to be quite fundamental shifts in the types of jobs that are available. So encouraging people to think about transferable skills, broadening their horizons in terms of different sectors that they might have not considered before, training and retraining and digital skills as well. I think also looking locally, everyone's world has become much smaller in the last 6 months or so, linking in with local groups that people trust, that know them, and thinking about the skills and jobs opportunities that are going to be available locally within local economies as well. And thinking about the contract model, the kind of vacancies, are there going to be vacancies advertised, or will providers need to almost work with employers to try and create and generate some of those vacancies for people coming through the Restart programme? What quality are those vacancies going to be? Thinking about hours and also how we can support progression. I will share the slides. There's a whole list of links to our IES publications, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for that, and what a useful insight into both what's been happening and what we might need to be thinking about. We're also working at Belina on a project called Workplace Safe Space, which came about because of the issues of the increase in domestic violence. And I'll just flag up that if there's any organisations here that want to be involved in that, put your name in the chat or contact me afterwards, and we can support you on that. So I think what I'm going to do, if it's all right with you, just because I'm conscious that some people might be doing this in a kind of an hour thing, I'm going to move straight on to Julia now, and then we'll come to questions at the end. I think that's probably the best way to do this now. So Julia, Professor Julia Rouse from Manchester University. I hope all of you are following the chat, because there's some fascinating stuff going on in there too, and lots of links which I'm trying to take out for you. But Julia, you've got a lot to say. I'm going to let you start in and say it right straight away. You're on mute. You're on mute.
As ever. Hello, everybody. I'm actually down the road at Manchester Metropolitan University, actually, but it's by the by. I'm going to talk about self-employment. I'm going to talk about prior to COVID, the effect of COVID, and then what we can think about in terms of programs going forwards. So I think it's a little known fact that most of the employment growth that came after the last recession was from self-employment, and that lasted for about 5 years. So you might say that we had a self-employment-led recovery, which poses interesting questions about whether or not we're going to have a self-employment-led recovery this time, and if we're not, what kind of recovery we are going to have and how. I was already concerned before COVID that a lot of the work created in self-employment was of poor quality. We had a precipitous decline in income from self-employment, and we had a large growth in women's self-employment, particularly mothers' self-employment during that period. Now, while people may say that they enter self-employment freely, if you like, and I think that there's this argument that kind of writing yourself into a new narrative of opportunity by writing a business plan and that kind of thing can feel very empowering. The reality is that a lot of the people starting those businesses are not making a living in running them. And it's, I think, a well-hidden fact, and probably well hidden in the way that sometimes these kind of programs are procured by local authorities, DWP and others, that we don't see the real effect at the other end. And it's only when we look at the hard data that we see these effects. I think they're pretty silenced. I've had a lot of difficulty getting civil servants to talk about this. At the same time, there's been mountains of research to show that entrepreneurship is a highly gendered field and that we need more gender aware provision. And also that there's a potential mismatch between universal credit, job centre requirements and self-employment. Universal credit doesn't work well with the bumpiness of self-employment income, etc. So all of that existed prior to COVID. And I should say that when we think about self-employment or small business ownership, we can think about women-led businesses, but we can also think about women who are often working in co-preneur, so couple businesses, and also in family businesses, and the minority stake they tend to take in those businesses. You can find out more about the state of women's enterprise in the link that I posted in the chat, because I'm part of an academic group called the Gender and Enterprise Network, and we've produced some state-of-the-art reviews, so 10-minute reads. I think there's 5 of them, in covering a range of topic areas that would bring you up very quickly with the evidence base around women's enterprise. So what about COVID then? Well, we know that COVID has hit the sectors in which women work the most, and therefore it's hit the sectors that women trade in most. And in particular, because women do more embodied work, social distancing is more difficult. And it is women's businesses that are embodied, if you like. So I'm thinking about beauticians and hairdressers and childminders and others, people who are doing body work, who have been particularly hard hit by COVID. And of course, the school and nursery closures, which, by the way, I was astounded that the government could close schools and nurseries without creating an employment right and some sort of equivalent financial payment to women entrepreneurs or at least parents was astounding as a policy move, and not in a good way. School and nursery closures have made it particularly difficult for women to trade and to do all the pivoting that people have been talking about in terms of trying to develop a resilient business model whereby their businesses can trade under COVID conditions. And I think it's really worth saying that the evidence base shows us that women entrepreneurs, most of whom work at home in very, very small scale businesses, often have to do daily negotiation to extract themselves from domestic tasks in order to have time to work in their businesses, because they don't have the boundary of having a boss who's expecting them somewhere. And imagine how much more so that would be under school and nursery or bubble closure conditions. But we did have some government support schemes. We have the self-employment income support scheme, which has given some fairly good protection, but there have been masses of exclusions from that. So we estimate that 750,000 people are excluded from the self-employment income support scheme. And many of those will be the kinds of businesses that programs will recently have been working with, because anybody who started a business or indeed entered profit in business after April 2019 won't have done a self-assessment and therefore will be excluded from the self-employment income support scheme. If your self-employment was lower than half of your income, so if you were doing cobbling together of employment and self-employment, particularly perhaps in the early stages of self-employment, or if you're somebody just cobbling together flexible work, you will have been excluded from the scheme. And pregnant women were given, women who'd had a past maternity were given a lower maternity self-employment income support scheme payment because of a past maternity. So even though they'd struggled through the maternity, come back to work, were now trying to trade with a baby in arms, they would have had a lower payment, about which there is a court case because it's a massive issue. So I'm working with Excluded UK and others to challenge these gaps, and there's also a gap around non-payment to business directors as well in small firms. The government's also gone for a policy of promoting loans, but we know that women are more risk averse in taking up those loans. Now, this can be seen as sort of some inherent risk averseness in women, but actually I think it's entirely rational, because women tend to trade in sectors that have lower profits, in very small scale businesses under states of high uncertainty, and often only for a period of time where they're trying to cobble together some flexible work. So why would you borrow to invest in that when really what you're trying to do is prop up your household economy? It actually is entirely rational that a lot of women entrepreneurs don't want to borrow. And the bounce back loans came with no marketing that was sensitive to that, because actually there is low household risk in the terms of a bounce back loan. And when we explained this to women on a one-to-one basis, they became more willing to take one. But none of the marketing was in any way gender aware, and this is despite big reviews. There's something called the Rouse review and other things that have gone on around women's financing, but this just didn't end up in the policy. At the beginning of COVID, we formed something called the Women's Enterprise Policy Group, which is a range of the key practitioners, or some of the key practitioners who've been delivering women's enterprise support for a long time, and some of the key researchers. And we came up with a policy framework, and I've posted that in the comments as well. I think there's two areas that we can think about here. One is supporting women who are already self-employed, and the other one is possibly supporting women to enter self-employment. The point here is that I think we really need to stop just channeling people into self-employment, and we need to repackage projects to be about good self-employment. And that might mean having a pre-enterprise realistic look at whether or not this is right for you, right for your welfare regime, right for your household, but also whether or not you really have a good idea for a business, and whether or not you have the right resources because it can be a good idea for someone, but is it a good idea for you to run that business? I'd like to see self-employment programs structured as learning journeys, where somebody is explicitly supported to work out whether or not they can create good work for themselves through self-employment, to monitor that, give it a go, and have an exit route if that's not the case. We know that some of the rise in low-paid self-employment has come from a decrease in exit from poor quality self-employment. So there seems to be a self-employment poverty trap. And so it's, in order to avoid that, I think we really need to stay with people longer, and we need to really position it as a learning experience so that you don't fail, even if your business fails, and also so that risks are managed. Because I've sat in high-rise flats with people spending their child benefit on a business in all good faith because somebody important has told them that, yes, they have a viable business idea, when you and I would know they don't have a viable business idea, or they don't have the resources to make that business idea happen. And I don't think that's uncommon. So I think that we really need to look to ourselves and think about the risks that we're asking other people to take, to support them to take managed risks. I'd like us to take a more ecosystem approach so that we help people to go on a resource accrual pathway so they can get access to further education. You know, maybe it's a catering qualification. If they want to open a cafe, they can get a placement in a catering, in a cafe. They can slowly, say, in running a street market, in developing their skills, so that we're not setting people up in businesses where they don't have the right resources, but we are buying in the enthusiasm that comes from the thought of running your own business to help people go on a learning and a resource accrual pathway. So to me, this isn't about individual programs. This is about places designing ecosystems of support that would promote people who are further from the labour market to have a realistic chance of having at least a good learning experience and possibly a good experience of entering self-employment. Now, should we have women-focused support? The evidence base tells us yes and no. Women like it. Some women like it. They like to learn in a space with other women. But on the other hand, you can't do business with men in a women-only network. COVID has convinced me that a lot of women, because of all the issues mentioned in the other presentations, are really seeking a sisterly space. That a lot of women, not all women, but a lot of women, would like a place where they can put all the scenarios of their lives, you know, their relationship, their children, the opening and closing of bubbles, their debt. They can put the whole lot on the table and work out, is self-employment right for them? How would they move forward? In a way that just is not typical in average business support. And it goes back to Marianne saying, you know, what's right for the average man isn't necessarily actually even right for the average man, but certainly not right for the average woman. So I think a lot of women are very isolated, very lonely, and would at this moment in history like a new to have women-only business support as part of a package. But I think we should use that as a critique back into the mainstream, that those women should be used as advocates, because we need to create also their networks back into mainstream business support, and we need to empower them to critique back into business support, the mainstream, what is going wrong with the kind of provision that they're seeing in those kinds of networks. And actually some of those contexts want to do the right thing, but they don't know how to do the right thing. In Wales, they've got a brilliant training materials for business advisors to give more gender sensitive business support. Is actually very good. But I'm not convinced that we're going to upskill a whole load of business advisors under times of crisis when they're dealing with all sorts of other things in gender awareness. And that's why I think that we have got a case here for a new programme. And this is what the Women's Enterprise Policy Group has boiled its framework down and said, if we had one ask, our ask would be to have a new and innovative programme of women-focused business support that would think about startup. It would think about valuing women-led sectors. So sectors like beauty and hair, which actually COVID has showed us hugely important in terms of employment, would be valued. sectors like early years, which need very specific support at the moment, would be valued. And also, we would say in terms of the industrial strategy, we completely go along with Women's Budget Group's work on investing in care services as a way of creating work, and women's enterprise support has got a role to play there as well. Also, in terms of getting on board with digitisation, I think a lot of women would like to learn in a women-only environment. And then that whole process of developing a business exit and thinking about what next steps kind of process as well. So all of this is important. We also need some programmes that are delivered exclusively to or very insensitive ways in relation to particular Black and minoritised ethnic groups of women and disabled women in particular. And we're working upon all these things in the Women's Enterprise Policy Group. So those are, and we've developed some briefings, by the way, for local enterprise partnerships, local authorities and combined authorities, which I could also share, because, you know, we're really keen that anybody should take those to their local holders of funds and try to convince them that they should commission some state-of-the-art women's enterprise support kind of provision. And I think that's it. That's what I had to say.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating. Are you getting it also? No. Okay. What a fascinating intervention, because I think one of the things around self-employment, I think you're absolutely right. A lot of people want to explore self-employment before they actually commit to it, and we need to have, I really like this idea of having some kind of gender-based approach to that. So thank you so much, and I want to come back, if nobody else does, on this idea of what we should be investing in as a society. It seems to me the point that you're making there, and I know the point the Women's Budget Group are making, is that you know, if we can invest all this in HS2, we can invest all this in you know, different ways of you know, supporting test and trace or whatever. What could you invest in supporting women? So I have a hand up for a question from Maggie. So Maggie, I don't have your surname or where you're from.
Hi, I'm Maggie Sikora. I'm the MD of MAPIS CIC. We've been delivering employability projects for local authorities and DWP for over 11 years now. And 2 years ago, before actually the lockdown, we've done a social enterprise for women from ethnic minorities and also with domestic violence backgrounds. And we found out that they were much more successful. So out of 8, 6 are still trading businesses. And they were completely economically inactive, and they were all victims of domestic abuse before that. But why it was successful? First, it was we've concentrated on social enterprise aspect, not just an enterprise, where they formed their own social enterprise group apart from their individual businesses, where they've supported each other as an environment, as a community. So I think if we add that, because we talk about enterprise for women, but this social enterprise is much more successful. So we need to add that aspect to the concept.
Yeah, I completely agree, Maggie. And I think there's another point to what you've said, and that is women tend to form extraordinarily tiny businesses. Yeah. And we do know from the evidence base that you're more likely to grow if you form a team-based business, whether that's mixed sex or single sex. So can our business startup processes convene team-based businesses rather than just working on a very individualized basis? I think is a really important challenge.
Marianne, Rosie, anything on that? Or any of the other points that any of the other speakers have raised?
I was just going to sort of expand on the point that we were trying to make is just women, but also there are people within that group, half the population. So, you know, people from different cultures, backgrounds, different financial capital, networks, etc. So thinking about it as a group, but also individually, what someone brings and what they might need in terms of support.
So looking at each person individually, whoever they are. Thank you. Marianne, you're on mute. Marianne, you're on mute.
Sorry. I think that's really important. And, you know, again, also having programs that recognise that people's journeys are going to take different amounts of time. You know, for some people, it's a question of just getting a little bit of support at the beginning. For other people who are a long way from the labour market, there's things about confidence building. There may be things about basic maths and literacy, or English as a second language, or sorting out practical problems. I mean, the project that you mentioned, Liz, at the beginning that we're involved with in Coventry brings together a number of women's organisations, including Falls Hill Women's Training, which does kind of employability support programmes for women. But it also works in partnership with the Rape Crisis Centre and the Women's Refuge and the local law centre. And the idea behind that project was by joining that women need holistic support, and that some of the women coming into refuge might later on down the line want support in possibly starting their own business, but also ESOL classes or maths or English classes. And some of the women coming to Falls Hill Women's Training for support with employability may be dealing with other issues that they've never spoken about before, and actually having those services all together and having such seamless pathways can help them deal with the other issues in their life. And that's back to the point I made in answer to Laura's question about the sanctions regime and the kind of insistence that what you've got to do is apply for a certain number of jobs, or you've got to reach a certain level of income, or the kind of minimum income assumptions in universal credit, for example, none of which allows time for people to resolve what can be really complicated and difficult issues before they're ready to either start work or start their own business.
Absolutely. And we found in our work that actually the ability to start a micro job is the best route in to start something and then to move on to something bigger. It's that progression that makes the difference. So Deborah Chowney and Camilla Rigby have both had their hands up for a long time. So I'm going to ask both of them to ask their questions or make their points. So, Deborah first and then Camilla. So Deborah.
Hello, good afternoon. I am an employment and training officer for a housing association, so I work with our customers. But to one side, I was also very involved with a women's small business network, where they were small businesses, women who'd started from, a seed of an idea. I absolutely agree with Julia. Unfortunately, too many people want to go into self-employment but do not have a viable business, and it doesn't earn enough to support them. And we've seen the DWP actually try and push this onto job seekers. We've seen texts go out recently about you can be an Avon rep and earn enough to live on. But where the biggest gap we found when we were working with women that would come to the network for support was those that had started a successful business had actually stayed in work and done this as well, and then seen if it was viable and had the background knowledge and able to do that. And we've found those that have failed have not had the knowledge, the skills to actually even be able to consider how they would complete a self-assessment tax return, or how to register. They really struggle with the basics, and that there was a lot of work to do before you could even get to that start of that business. And a very big issue for those of the customers I'm working with is digital poverty. They just don't have the connectivity, they don't have the kit, and you need all of those things, I think, and truly believe, in order to start and be successful in business. And another area is, I understand what you say about women supporting women, but if you're going to be successful in business, you've got to be able to deal with men too. And too many avoid the difficult conversations, not able to do those negotiations. And we've got to build that in that it's good to support someone at the start, but we've got to build in, if you want to be successful in business, you've got to deal with everyone if they're going to be your customer.
Excellent point. Excellent point. So I'm going to ask Camilla, and then I'll ask the speakers to come back in. Camilla, you've had your hand up a long time.
That's okay. Thank you. So we launched our CIC earlier this year, pre-COVID, and have been trounced like everyone else has, in that a 12-week programme has lasted for 7 months. But looking ahead, we've just got some funding to do, we're going to be probably running 5 programmes next year, and we do training combined with work experience, which is partly funded by businesses in Bristol, where we're based, and Bath, and other grant funding. One of the challenges, I think, and I just wanted to see if others are feeling this as well, is that the case for our social enterprise existed pre-COVID, and we had more than 70 people apply for 15 places on this first programme. And then COVID happened, and we know, obviously, in all the stats we heard earlier about it disproportionately affecting women. We're feeling a lot of pressure, I think, even before we've opened applications for the programmes next year, of how to prioritise and not push the women who are already being marginalised and pushed further away. We've got 80% of our mums are single mums. We've got 65% who are survivors of domestic abuse. These are people who already needed this support, and they're being pushed further and further and further away. I just wanted to understand if anybody who's a lot closer, I guess, to Restart than we probably are at the moment, is there any kind of prioritisation, in the same way that Kickstart has said that it's got to be young people who are most at risk for long-term unemployment? Is there going to be a similar thing for Restart? Does anybody know? And any advice on how we can prioritise what we're expecting, which is going to be an influx of women who quite rightly deserve our support, but it's just trying to make sure we get the support to the right people, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think the point that you're making there about people having a complexity of needs. So if you're a lone parent, you might have other issues as well. Or if you face domestic abuse, you might have other issues as well. All of those things come together. Okay, so can I go back to our speakers now to respond to both of those points?
I'll respond to the first point. I agree with absolutely everything that you've said. When I say women-focused business support, I have some reservations about it, and I think it needs to be in the context of creating networks into the mainstream and giving women the skills and the confidence to be able to work in those contexts as well, and also in those sectors as well. So, I mean, this is about a package of support, isn't it? That doesn't just have a very early phase, but enables them to do a number of things over time. But I completely agree with you about needing some basic digital skills, some basic literacy, some basic financial literacy. These are all really important basic prerequisites of running a business, which can be overlooked, and there can be this sense of people being pushed into this because it's bums on seats, and it's, you know, out of one pot and into another, and they're counted in different ways and what have you. And I'm just, my message to DWP and local authorities is, if what you do is end up creating chronic low-paid self-employment, which is a poverty trap, this is certainly not how you should be measuring programmes, if that is the way, if that is what it produces. So you need to start commissioning something different to that. And I think, you know, Women's Enterprise Policy Group and others have got some ideas about how you can do that. So come and talk to us.
Excellent. Okay, Rosie, have you got anything you want to come in on the how we could make employability programs better?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just scribbling down some notes. So in terms of your question, Camilla, about how to prioritise, I'm not totally sure about the kind of the outcomes that you're looking for from your project, but I think the programmes that we're evaluating at the moment, obviously the types of people that are presenting, coming through, have very much changed in the last 6 months, and the sort of the recency of their employment experience. From evaluating things like the work programme and past programmes, it's very easy if you've got a payment by results contract that is looking to get people straight into jobs. Those people that have that recency of experience is they're just much easier to place, and you'll get the money in. I think one example where from a contract perspective, the combined authority has flexed the payment structure to incentivise people to continue to work with those that are have more complex needs or that are harder to help at this time, and reduced the payment for getting people back to work who are kind of less than 6 months unemployed. So there might be something around recency of employment experience, and I don't know whether you would kind of recruit based on that and have diverse recruitment targets based on that, so you're getting a spread of people with different different types of backgrounds and different needs. Other approaches that we've come across in terms of screening is really trying to assess people's motivations and reasons for joining, looking at their direction and the kind of the fit with the programme, as to whether or not they're then supported. And this is for a sort of a training support programme that's got an employer attached at the end. So again, I don't know if that's quite right, but the fit with the job that's at the end. And so coming at it from a vacancy or employer point of view, what's the skills of the person that they're going to need, and working back from that as another kind of way of managing it. But I think generally we are noticing, obviously, way more people are wanting work and fewer jobs. So anything to stimulate demand, think about creating jobs, or getting employers to think in different ways about the types of people recruit, and having conversations about diversity within that, so they're not just going for the same types of people as in the past.
That's really helpful, thank you. We're trying to for them next year to go around where we know that the skills gaps are. So we're doing one around women in construction, one for women in healthcare, because we've got a good link in with the NHS now, and then one for more professional and digital, because we're working with lots of corporates who want that. But it's the tempting thing is to, as you say, to go for like the low-hanging fruit, and it's having the bravery to push back a little bit on our funders and say that we don't want to just have a metric of X number of people getting a job. That I think it was Marianne that was saying about the other outcomes. So for someone that goes back to college and retrains for a different profession, that is as valuable, I think, as getting a job and something with no real progression or anything like that. So it's trying to be a bit braver.
Thank you so much. Marianne, would you like to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of points, and I agree very much with what the other speakers have said, and particularly this issue about the way in which employability programs are measured and rewarded, and actually that's a question for government. That's a policy question about what you build in to those contracts, and if you build something in that's basically about throughput, high levels of throughput, without much concern about longer term outcomes, or indeed that you're picking people who would probably have got another job fairly quickly by themselves anyway, then that seems to me a kind of wasted intervention. The issue about different sorts of support schemes for women. I mean, I think one of the things when I was saying about needing a gendered approach is it's not just about saying, oh, we've got this special program for women and that's us with our gendered approach. It's actually saying the whole of your approach has to take into account things like the fact that people will be carers as well as workers, and that might affect their availability to work. And that has to be there for everybody, not just for women. I think there is also a space, as other speakers have said, for support networks for women at particular phases, and networks where you can bring the whole of your life and not just your kind of job or business related problems. But that does have to link in with other wider networks, and those networks might be local. I mean, it depends what business you've got, doesn't it? I mean, sometimes your networks are very, very local and place based, and sometimes they're sectoral based, depending on what you're in. The other thing that I wanted to flag up, and this point that Julia made about unrealistic business ideas, I think is a really important one. And also, one of the things that's concerning me, I mean, to be honest, more just from some of the people that I know and some mums that I meet at the school gates, is that when people are in a vulnerable situation, as very many people are now, they are very vulnerable to a lot of, multi-level marketing type schemes and those sorts of, you can earn £2,000 a week while looking after your children full time and everything else. And those, despite many attempts to address them, they just kind of re-emerge with different labels and different guises, and they're so insidious and it's so damaging. And so very many women are attracted to them at a point when they're at their most desperate and they're least able to cope, both with the financial hit that is generally caused because you get sucked into paying out money, but also the psychological impact of kind of being part of this network where everyone's encouraged to pretend that everything's brilliant even when it isn't, which is not good for people's mental health apart from anything else. And I think that really does need to be addressed and thought about, particularly if you're looking at government programmes that are trying to promote entrepreneurship. Thank you. Lucy, you've got your hand up, and I think you might be our last question. So let's hear what you've got to say.
Thanks. I just wanted to pick up, everyone mentioned childcare at various points in the different presentations, and I just wondered if people have got thoughts on how we ensure that childcare in particular is part of a future industrial strategy rather than somehow being seen as separate from or assumed to be there, when all of the evidence and everything that people have talked about shows absolutely how vital it is, but also we know the sector's under extreme pressure at the moment. So just how we tie these conversations together so we don't get stuck talking about jobs without a recognition that childcare is a sector that employs a huge number of women, but also is part of that essential social infrastructure.
I think childcare is a bit like herd immunity, isn't it? We need to have enough childcare in the whole of society that we don't have to worry about it anymore, that it's there. Have our speakers got anything they want to add on that, on childcare? Yeah, I think Lucy's absolutely right. And, one of the things that we talk a lot about at the Women's Budget Group is childcare and other forms of social infrastructure, and why they are as important as physical infrastructure. People don't just need roads to enable them to get to work. They need childcare providers to enable them to get to work, and they both have to be considered part of industrial strategy. So there's that kind of policy level thing. I think at the moment, in the short term, we need an emergency injection of cash into the system. And the childcare sector was already underfunded pre-COVID. The amount of money that government paid for the free childcare places was insufficient to cover the cost of those places. So childcare providers were reliant on cross-subsidising with paid-for hours, which obviously increased the cost of paid-for hours, and particularly care for the under-twos. Which becomes very expensive because of that. And also that the structure of the sector isn't always helpful. The childcare sector is a big mix. You have small local providers, you have social enterprises, but you also have some big chains, and there's a kind of move in the direction of what's happened in social care, where you get some very big kind of international chains and money coming in, and that is about it's not about providing childcare anymore. It's actually about, often it's a property business where the costs of the mortgage on your property are paid for by the childcare fees, and that, people will pull out of that very quickly if it's not making the profits that they expect. So in the short term, we need, an immediate cash injection to stop the sector from failing. But in the medium term, we actually need to develop a proper childcare strategy and a rethink of the sector. And I think our kind of demand side support, which is basically, here's some free hours that parents can have, isn't the right way forward. We actually need to think, we don't do this with education, for example. Why would we do it for preschoolers? Why don't we have nurseries in every community the way we have primary schools in every community? We know that high quality childcare has a really positive impact on child outcomes and can help close attainment gaps. So it's not just about the availability of childcare, it's also about the quality of childcare that you get. And I don't think you can guarantee that if it's left entirely to the private sector. And the earlier we put that resource in, the longer benefit it has, doesn't it? Okay, Julia, and then Rosie, I'm going to close with you because we need to end this session soon. Marianne, if you've got one final thing to say, that'd be great too. So Julia, this is your kind of final roundup now.
Well, first of all, have a look at the Women's Budget Group stuff on a care-led recovery, because it's incredibly convincing economic argument about a genuine, this isn't about spending money on an output, this is about money that will end up being an input to the economy, and rethinking fundamentally the role of childcare in the economy. Secondly, a lot of childcare workers may have missed out on the self-employment income support scheme, and I'm working with Manchester City Council to look at poverty amongst childminders. Now, the thing is that every local authority has a list of childminders, so they do know how to get their lockdown funding to their childminders, but they need to be reminded to do it. So please contact your local authority and urge them to do that. Another thing is that they also know all their early years businesses. And so when they get all this business support money, they need to be reminded to target that at the early years businesses, because I don't always think about these trains which fit within the council itself. And we just need to each of us be in there and prodding them to do that for our childcare sector.
Absolutely, it's one council at a time, isn't it?
It really is, yeah.
Okay, Rosie, final sum up for you.
Yeah, no, I think the point I'd just make is from an individual perspective about the affordability of childcare, and that actually just the cost of it for some women who are particularly on low pay, it just makes it's not economical sense. There's also lots of steps in the system, so the amount that you might have to contribute or pay and the amount of free hours that you get changes over time. So I think as an employment service provider, talking about where the children are in that and your entitlement at various points in time and how that might change, because that really will change fundamentally whether or not someone is better off in work or not at various points.
Okay, Marianne, I'm just going to come to you for one last final thing, summing up the session today.
Just that I wish that I talked about the care-led recovery in my answer just then. I did in my first talk, but thank you very much to Julia for that. That's really great. I mean, I think this has been really interesting, and one of the things that it's really shown for me is the kind of complexity of these issues, that you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. You can't have a very simplistic, we're just going to do this. And what you need doesn't fit neatly into a three-word slogan, which is slightly unfortunate when dealing with this government, because they like their three-word slogans. But people's lives are complicated, and that means that the support that they need at different points in their lives will also be complicated.
Okay, well, thank you so much to our speakers. It's been absolutely fantastic to have you here. We're really, really pleased to have had this opportunity. What I think have sort of taken away from this is that we're all saying that we do need some sort of specific spaces, and that the complexity of the issues that women face is something that we need to look at on an individual basis. There's not just one size fits all there, but that long term, maybe women-led recovery is what we could say as our three-word slogan. But maybe there's, this idea that actually in the long term, it's about creating something so that women can go back and compete. The issue that our programme, we're always saying is that women now have a 50-year career. They have to work from 18 to 68, and we need to create within that opportunities for them to have their children and to go back to work, and to be able to develop their careers whatever time they start. Even if you don't start working now, if you've had a family, you don't start working until you're 35, you've still got 30 years to go forward. So I think the new programs need to look at that, the length of women's careers, and creating, as people are saying here, not just jobs, but opportunities for people to progress. And it's good to see that a number of the programs that are out there are doing that. So thank you so much to our speakers. And then I'm also just going to say to all the employability organisations that are here, there are obviously organisations here that are working with women. There are organisations here that are developing their programmes for Restart. And I know that ERSA is going to be a centre where those people can get together. So please keep in touch with ERSA and look at the activities that are available to everybody to meet and talk to each other. And also, we have just what everybody wants for Christmas, a special general meeting for ERSA to change its association to become to get charitable status. So I know that that's what everybody wants to attend in the couple of weeks before the festive season. But in order to entice you there, to have Claire Ward, who CEO of the Institute for Collaborative Working, who'll be speaking on what collaboration means and how it can work in practice in a competitive market. And the wonderful Elizabeth Taylor will be giving an overview of what ERSA has been doing in the last year and letting you know how we're all going to be working together. So thank you so much. We had over 80 people here for the main part of the session, which is just amazing. Thank you everybody for participating. I know recorded if anybody wants to have that opportunity to watch it again, to listen to everything. We've taken some of the links out of the sessions, out of the chat, so we'll try and put those somewhere. I don't know how we keep those long term. And just to say thank you so much, and we'll keep in touch, and we'll see you all at the next ERSA event. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Zoom wave.